Hi, I'm Joel Bridewell. Thanks for joining me for Select the Bible Topic Tuesday. And if you haven't seen it yet, what I dealt with on Monday was marriage and family, but dealt with the issue of singleness because that's also a part of the extended family and the family of God. So you can go back and take a look at that one if you'd like. And next time I'll deal with Witnessing Wednesday and just really to talk about a way to share the gospel. There's different ways out there. I'll share one of those ways. But tonight, you guys voted through Facebook and Twitter, and the most votes were for New Testament culture. So obviously in a short video, I can't cover all the New Testament culture, but I want to point out a few things that we encounter when we read the New Testament that the average reader doesn't pick up on and may misunderstand. So for instance, when Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, he talks about deacons and he says they must be the husband of one wife. Some people think, well, that means it's against polygamy. Well, husband, one wife, it means something, at least loyalty to the wife they have, and probably means something more. But it doesn't really address polygamy because polygamy is not an issue by the New Testament era. It was more common in the Old Testament culture, but not very common at all in the New Testament era. So that's not being intended, and people maybe assume that it is because of what things have said and practices in the Old Testament. Another one is the issue of slavery. So slavery comes up. The book of Philemon, for instance, Ephesians references slaves and masters, as does Colossians. Peter does, and so forth. So people assume, especially in American context, that slavery must have been something like it was in America. Well, it's nothing like that at all. As a matter of fact, it's been said by F.F. Bruce and others that as many as 1/3 of the Greco-Roman world in the New Testament era had been slaves at some point. But some of those were slaves for just a very short time, because what a slave could do is a slave could earn their freedom. They didn't have credit card debt. They didn't have mortgages and loans back then. So when you, either through something you needed or through something that happened to you, were not able to pay someone back with something, you could become their slave, and you would be a bondservant and serve them for a set amount of time until that was paid off. And that's similar to what we might call an employer-employee relationship today, as opposed to American slavery. And so when you read passages about masters and slaves, some people just immediately want to throw away the Bible and say, it promotes slavery, I don't want anything to do with it. Well, no, not the slavery that we know of. A different form, and I've talked about before, debt is a type of slavery. We don't like to think of it that way, but it is. And so that's kind of what we see happen in the New Testament. And then also, I'll mention one more, and that is the sort of the seclusion that the Jews would practice. They would not associate with Gentiles. They wouldn't even associate with Samaritans, who are half Jew, half Gentile. And so when Jesus goes through Samaria, for instance, in John chapter 4, there's a divine necessity for him to do that, because he has an appointment with this woman at the well in Samaria to identify himself as the Messiah and to point out some things in her life so that she would recognize that he's the Messiah. But what he does is he breaks down several barriers, because he talks with a Samaritan. That was sort of a no-no among the Jews. He talks with a woman. That was a no-no in that culture, to not be married to that woman and then to have this conversation, kind of a private conversation, whereas other people aren't around and so forth, like it might have been at a party or festive gathering. So Jesus begins to break down some of those barriers, and Jesus really elevates the status of women, because in most cultures up until that time, women had not been thought of very highly. Jesus has some of his followers that are women, some of the disciples that support him. Luke chapter 8 talks about some of those. And then the fact that he carries on a conversation with one is a big deal. So he begins to elevate the status of women and begins to break down barriers so that Jews could talk with other groups, not just Samaritans, but eventually Gentiles as well. And of course, the gospel eventually makes its way to the Gentiles in the book of Acts, and what Jesus did through his death and resurrection and such. So that's just a little bit about some of the New Testament culture and the customs we come across, the things we come across there that'll help you as you read through that portion. We'll deal with some other time, but thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. God bless.